Welcome, Eric.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Now, it's so great to have you on Mod TV today to talk about our theme of disruption. And as our viewers would have picked up from your bio, you cover a lot of different grounds. So we're going to have a lot of different ways to approach disruption in today's chat. But maybe we'll start a little bit simpler, just with, would you be able to give us a rundown of your role at UniSA?
Yeah, so at UniSA, as you kindly announced earlier, I'm a lecturer in sociology. So I'm part of the sociology program. And also at UniSA, I am part of the Hawke Monnet Center of Excellence. And what we do at this particular Center of Excellence is we try to understand sort of the pressing issues both facing Australia and the EU. Now, it probably is not a great surprise to you that what faces both contexts are actually quite similar, and they're oftentimes global issues. Disasters is certainly one of them, and that's been a part of my research for, I don't know, the past 5 years. And you know, when it comes to this particular topic, I've been quite fascinated by, I guess, just how it can be studied from so many different angles, obviously. So, you know, if you're an environmental scientist, you might try to understand sort of the environmental causes or the effects of various disasters. But I'm a sociologist, you know, that's hopefully was clear by the intro. I'm a sociologist. I'm interested in the social and cultural determinants and aspects of behavior. And this also applies to the study of disasters as well. In fact, you could say, and this is going to sound strange to some people, you could say that there is no sort of field of disaster research if there's not a social cultural component. And why is that the case? And it's because, you know, disasters are oftentimes defined by virtue that they affect human societies in some way. If there's like an earthquake in the middle of the ocean, I don't think you'll see a headline that says disaster, you know, earthquake strikes in the middle of the Pacific, right? It's because they affect human societies. And it's not just that they affect human societies, they are thought to negatively affect how humans live their lives.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not like someone's out and they see a nice winter day in South Australia, you know, a very sunny day, and they go, oh, this is disastrous. I can't believe this happened, right? This run of days that we have. So it has to negatively affect people's lives. And that's, of course, social. What we consider to be sort of a positive or a pernicious development or event, that's social. So that's along with that. So your original question was asking me, what do I do at this university? So essentially, it's to do research. And should we move on to talking about sort of more of my thoughts around disasters more broadly, or do you want?
Yeah, because we were talking about in the green room before that, you know, it's relevant to have you on at the moment because of the pandemic. But, you know, talking about the incidental disasters that we cause with the environment and, you know, all the greenhouse gases and things like that. So maybe, yeah, if we could talk about your general research in disasters and go beyond the pandemic at the moment even.
Yeah, so I got interested in disasters because I've been working with some colleagues in Japan, and following the March 11th triple disaster there, it was high on their research agendas. Now, I'm one of those people that likes to return to first principles. So I got interested in the topic, but then I thought to ask, well, what is a disaster exactly, right? How do we even define? We call a lot of things disasters, you know? We can talk about, you know, obviously environmental social disruptions as disasters, but we can also say things like, you know, I think the other day I spilt wine on a pair of trousers that I liked, and I thought that was a disaster. Yeah. So I was like, what is a disaster? You know, what is a disaster? And what I noticed very quickly was that, at least in the social sciences, but this is true probably more broadly, there's a tendency to define disasters as rapidly occurring events, or more specifically, rapidly occurring social disruptions. And this is pretty evident in terms of how we just discussed COVID, right? COVID sort of came out of nowhere, supposedly. It unfolded very quickly, and indeed, you see exponential growth of new cases. And so that's a cause of concern, because it was not only unforeseen, but it happened very, very suddenly. And so, that makes sense to us. When we think of disasters, we normally pick events that sort of fit that model: earthquakes, tornadoes. These things, or indeed pandemics. These things usually occur quite quickly. But then I thought, well, what are the consequences of defining disasters in this way? And are there certain types of social disruptions that are very slow moving? They are more ambient. They're much more incremental and gradual. And then I thought, well, what about climate change? That's one of the grand challenges facing people today. And yet, I don't ever hear people talking about it as a disaster. It might be linked to disasters, right? I mean, climate change is the increase in frequency with which certain disasters occur, but it in itself is not considered a disaster. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. Why is that? What are the consequences of defining disasters so narrowly? And if we expand our understanding of disasters to encompass slow-moving events, well, what does this allow us to do? I think, first of all, allows us to understand why certain social disruptions are responded to in the way that they are. So if we want to understand, for example, why political responses to climate change differ perhaps to political responses to more temporally focused events like the COVID-19 pandemic, then I think it all has to do with the time, right? I mean, with slow-moving disasters or slow-moving sort of social disruptions, I think there's a sense that we can just put it off, and we don't actually have to listen to the experts. We can just let things go. And so my calling attention to the fact that we might want to expand the definitions of disasters, the consequence, I think, of doing that is it, first of all, focuses attention on things that perhaps might be quite consequential, but they aren't exactly always immediately evident. So, for example, the acidification of the Earth's oceans, growing resistance to antibiotics, and of course, climate change. But of course, the one thing I should quickly mention is that I'm not trying to say here, though, that temporally focused disasters aren't important. They certainly are. They absolutely are. So I don't think it's necessarily an either or, but it's trying to draw attention and urgency to social disruptions that are much more gradual and ambient. The other thing I should quickly mention about that is, I think when it comes to something like COVID, we're oftentimes bombarded with the consequences of it. Okay, so there's a great episode of Radiolab, a podcast that I really enjoy, that I listen to. And they talked about how there's all these counters related to COVID-19 that we see every single day, right? New cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. And what's fascinating to me about that is, there are counters for other disruptions and other sort of social issues that people face. I mean, if there was a counter for the number of people that die on the road each year, I think people would be horrified, right? And does anyone say, well, no more driving? We're going to stop driving until the deaths go to zero. No new cases. No, I mean, and so I think it's important to try to draw visibility to slow moving disasters, is what I've been calling them. But of course, the one thing I am very mindful of, though, is that we can't say that slow-moving disasters and rapidly occurring ones are exactly the same. I mean, there certainly are differences, not only in terms of the effects they have, but also in terms of the ways in which people can respond.
I feel as well that, as you were saying as well about the time in which it takes place, with something like climate change, it's a lot less tangible to a lot of people because, to a certain extent, with COVID, there are places in the world that have been affected quicker and more substantially. And the same thing will kind of play out in the timeline of climate change, or the communities that are going to feel climate change the first aren't necessarily the ones who can always do the most to change it. And so those of us living in parts of the world that won't suffer the consequences first, they're like, well, what's the issue? We're not suffering consequences now.
There is a really interesting concept developed by an American researcher named Timothy Morton, and he talks about something called hyperoptics. And hyperoptics basically, it describes phenomena that are massively distributed in both time and space. And he actually counts climate change as one of these. And it's because climate change isn't something that one generation can fix or address. It's not like, societies can simply just like do a series of things and then that's it, it's done, We have fixed climate change once and for all. That's not that.
We wondered how you'd get that in.
Yeah, we were waiting for it. We're like,
thanks very much. Thanks. But it's because that's the case. I think it actually presents us with a very interesting sort of dilemma, which is, in what ways are disasters actually not simply just unforeseen, but they're recurrent, or they're somehow also structural, and structural not because that's just life. It could be because of the ways in which societies are built. So there was a really interesting idea that I came across when I was first getting into disasters research, and it was actually developed by a colleague of mine in Japan named Miwao Matsumoto, and he talked about disasters being structural. And he drew from the work of the French urban theorist Paul Virilio. Paul Virilio was really interested in accidents. And if you read any of his work, he's pretty out there. But he talked about how accidents aren't simply like unplanned or unforeseen. Anytime you invent something, you also invent its accident, which I thought was a very interesting idea. Okay. And I think, I'm not sure when it came out, but I guess recently, if we can call it that. I remember watching the HBO miniseries Chernobyl. Okay. And when you invent the nuclear sort of reactor, a nuclear energy, you also, amazingly enough, invent nuclear disasters and meltdowns.
Right. Yeah.
And actually, the late German sociologist Ulrich Beck came up with a pretty interesting idea. He said that, some of the hazards that us modern people face, they can no longer be tested in a lab. Meaning, you couldn't have sort of instituted nuclear energy safely in a lab before, according to him, unleashing it around the world. It needed to be tested in the world. Does that kind of make sense? And he argues that the whole world has become a kind of a laboratory. And so some people argue this is the case when it comes to AI or nanotechnologies and things of the sort. But I think it's drawing attention to the fact that I think disasters are to some extent structural. But at the same time, I mean, this is what sociologists always do, right? We always equivocate. And this is why it's probably very frustrating to talk to a person like myself, because I want to say they're structural, but at the same time, I don't want us to be resigned to the fact that this is just what will always happen, right? And there's a really interesting piece that I came across in my research. It was by Barbie Zelazar. She's a really fantastic historian, and she was trying to understand how people always compared genocides around the world to the Holocaust. Okay, and she said, it's useful to learn from the past, absolutely, but if you always compare things to the past, it's very easy to become resigned to that these atrocities can always occur. They just simply always happen, and we should just accept it. And so her interesting point was, when people started comparing things to the Holocaust, that sometimes that's actually counterproductive. Rather than saying, oh, how terrible it is, people just go, oh, it's another one of them. And there's nothing we can do because they always exist. And I feel like it's the same with, things like climate change. If it increases the frequency of things like hurricanes or cyclones, I guess you would call them here, or it increases, droughts, the length of droughts, these are increasing frequency. They're not necessarily a change in the quality of disasters. And my concern is if people just come too habituated to the fact that these things occur, they won't want to do anything about them. Although I should just give a shout out to a colleague of mine. His name is Louis Everest, and he did a very fascinating study which looked at youth responses to climate change and disasters in Australia and in Portugal. And what he found was actually quite interesting. He found that young people were actually willing to contribute part of the government budget to addressing climate change more than some of the older generations were, which is pretty fascinating because oftentimes you think it's the older generations who might just want to contribute funding towards this. But it was quite fascinating, and also he found that the level of contribution that older people would make towards disaster mitigation through climate change mitigation efforts was actually quite high as well. So anyways, I think the thing with disasters that's really quite fascinating is how first of all the temporality matters a lot, like the timing. I oftentimes do think that timely response to disasters is essential. I mean, that's a very basic idea, isn't it? Right? If we're oftentimes judged by how quickly we respond to things. And by the way, I'll say something more about that later. But at the same time, we also need to think about the spatial implications as well. So the spatial implication of disasters is fascinating because just as there's a tendency to define disasters as being temporally focused, they're rapidly occurring, they occur within short time frames. I think there's also been a tendency to think about disasters as only affecting one context. And so one of the things that a colleague of mine, Professor Anthony Elliott, who's also at UniSA, what we did in our edited volume called The Consequences of Global Disasters, what we tried to do was tried to sort of broaden out disasters to encompass really the globe. And obviously we're seeing this with COVID-19. I mean, it was published in 2016. We didn't we didn't obviously predict that something like this would happen. But nevertheless, I think it's got to show us that there is a global aspect to disasters, and that we can actually also use globalization theory to inform how disasters unfold. And certainly, I think it's certainly the case that disasters don't affect every place the same way. I mean, that's certainly the case. We see even within Australia, right? Mm-hmm. It's unevenly distributed. The effects of COVID-19. But at the same time, there is something that's quite amazing that's going on also. And I think people who talk about COVID-19 as leading to the end of globalization, right? So obviously no one's really traveling overseas. Supply chains are starting to be reconfigured. I think that's a little bit short-sighted. And there's a lot of people who've written about this, because I think just as COVID-19 has been spread by sort of global processes and forces, maybe the desire to resume them might also lead to a solution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And it's really interesting talking about like the social impact and, referring it back to the past, because I grew up in the Darling Ranges of WA. So for me, bushfires were very common, and you had an action plan and you'd have your important documents packed. So because you knew in summer there will be bushfires, it will be raining ash. It was very normal. So when the bushfires started, for me, I was like, that happens. I don't know what everyone's worried about. Bushfires happen. But, living in Adelaide, which is a city, people started to really freak out when the smoke happened. And it took me a really long time to be like, oh, this isn't normal. Like, this is my normal, but it's not normal. And it took me a while to realize, like, oh, this is climate change. This is linked to all the droughts. So it definitely took a moment for me to go, oh, this is all linked. So, yeah, it's interesting you talk about that progression and then that social lens that I was watching it through as well completely changed my perspective. It took me ages to come around to the fact that this is an actual disaster. This isn't common.
A colleague of mine in Japan has noticed there's been a shift in how governments talk about people's reaction to disasters, and certainly also their own reaction. So before there was an emphasis on security, making sure people are feeling secure and in terms of their well-being, their belongings, their livelihoods. And there's been a shift from that to talking about resilience. You talk about increasing community resilience, and that sounds great, right? We want people to be resilient, but his concern is that if you focus too much on resilience, you pretty much absolve the state. You stop governments and societies of like needing to do anything
Absolutely.
to protect. So I guess that's one of the things that I think is quite fascinating about some of the discussion we've had today is, what is the role of people and culture when it comes to mitigating and dealing with disasters? Is it just sort of left up, we just have to get better at dealing with them by ourselves? Or do we actually need to deal with this at a societal level?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we definitely get that, the stiff upper lip, just get on with it, she'll be right, push through. Yeah, there's definitely that attitude that's quite prevalent.
Yeah, and and another thing I should quickly mention, just as disasters, I think, are oftentimes socially based, they also at the same time can be socially addressed. And I think that I don't know if that's a good place to are there questions? Or should we? But around that, but that's not a terrible place to end in terms of.
No, well, I was going to say that's a great quote to pull out from today. We'll definitely have to make a note of that. And we are. I've just realized we're so close to 4:30. So maybe before we let you go, if anyone who's watched today is interested in knowing more, pursuing more, just reading more about the kind of things we've been discussing, where would you suggest that they go?
Well, certainly you can visit my personal website to see some of the publications that I've produced. It's just the website, I think, is just ericlhsu.com. But you can also visit the Hawke EU Jean Monnet Center of Excellence's website. So if you just type in Hawke EU Center on Google, it's a lot more straightforward. And that's Hawke like Bob Hawke, not like Hawke like, flying bird hawk.
Important distinction.
Important distinction, absolutely. I specifically highlight that as a resource because we've been doing some hopefully interesting things around looking at how people in the EU have responded to disasters and also more specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so a few weeks ago, I did a master class with a urban studies and urban planners expert from Copenhagen. And we talked about how COVID-19 might be transforming people's idea of the livable city and this idea of the smart city. And I think that's quite fascinating because her point was, and this is, by the way, something that I think people from Adelaide can especially relate to. When we think about livable cities, okay, we actually oftentimes don't think of cars. And we think of like open spaces, walkable spaces where people can cycle. But that's not oftentimes the priority of urban planners around South Australia or more broadly in Australia, right? Or in other parts of the world as well. And so when we see images of livable cities, they almost I don't think anyone's ever saying, come to Adelaide to drive the Southern Expressway. We can go both directions now, right? Maybe some people are, who knows?
That's what we say to our relatives to stay. It goes two ways now.
Yeah.
It goes two ways. Bigly. But nevertheless, COVID might be doing something to the way in which we think things, in terms of how we understand livability to be defined. There's a big push to sort of emphasize the role of the car, and I think this is so if you want to learn more about these sort of topics, Hawke EU Center website. We're also hosting a few events and also more than happy to get emails, comments from anyone online. Being outwardly facing, being engaged with publics, that's what we should do. And I thank you for the opportunity today to do that.
No, well, thank you. Sorry,
thank
Lee, go ahead.
No, I was going to say thank you for joining us, and we'll have our chat moderator drop the links in below as well. So
thanks very much.
People should have the links to go straight to it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, well, that's a great place for you to leave us on today. It all just came to a perfect cadence. So thanks again so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eric.